Guatemala, 1954. The Central Intelligence Agency launches an operation codenamed PB Success to overthrow the government that is threatening American interests in the region. It is the first ever mission of its kind.
Operation PB Success was risky, it was dangerous.
500 rebels will face off against a president's army of 6,000.
There's a lot dependent on this op, and they can't let it go wrong.
The CIA has hand-picked the next leader of Guatemala, and he is the head of the rebel force. The soldiers will be trained by Rip Robertson, a legendary paramilitary agent.
Come on.
And their weapon of choice? Psychological warfare, used by the CIA for the very first time.
Black psychological warfare revolves around deception, lies.
Based on recently declassified files, we reveal the CIA's first ever attempt to overthrow a left-wing government in Latin America. Washington, D.C. A top-secret meeting is convened at the White House. Its task: to deal with a brand-new security threat. A small country in Central America, Guatemala. Present are America's most powerful men. The President, Dwight Eisenhower, his Secretary of State, and Allen Dulles, head of the Central Intelligence Agency.
Eisenhower ran the government in a very clandestine way, and the three of them concocted a lot of strategies around the world.
Now they have a new problem. A country less than 800 miles from America's southern border, Guatemala, has recently elected a leader with known communist links, Jacobo Arbenz Guzman. Already, Arbenz has begun to threaten American interests. His government confiscates thousands of acres of land from the multinational company United Fruits.
This added up to being a national security threat to the United States of America.
With the Cold War well underway, the concern in Washington is preventing the spread of communism throughout the world, and in particular, the Western Hemisphere.
The CIA started to see communists under every rock.
And they were willing to commit forces to tear them out of power.
The decision is made. Arbenz must be removed.
The CIA had been itching for an operation to overthrow the Guatemalan government.
The president is shown a highly classified document, which contains an extraordinary plan. It's called Operation PB Success.
They gave him the outlines of how you can overthrow an established regime without committing any American forces at all.
The plan is to secretly back an armed uprising against Guatemala's freely elected leader, Arbenz, and topple him in a coup d'etat. But Eisenhower is nervous. The CIA plot must not be traced back to the American president.
Why was the U.S. so afraid of being involved? One, because it would be seen as overthrowing a democratically elected government. It would be violating the tenets of the treaty it had signed at the United Nations. It would have been a gigantic black eye for American ideals.
It had to be covert. It couldn't be traceable to the president.
The operation combines three key strategies. First, to invade with a small, specially trained force. Next, to apply external political pressure. And finally, to use a whole host of covert agency tricks.
PB Success had a new strategy, things that had not been seen before. modes of action that had never been practiced before.
The methods are so novel that the CIA don't even know if it's going to work.
It was dangerous because nobody knew exactly what would happen.
They give the operation only a 40% chance of success.
The CIA had to turn this on a dime into an actionable, workable covert operation.
Eisenhower said, I'm all for it, let's go with it. I think it's going to work, and I think it's important to do.
The CIA's first move is to establish a command center at Opa-locka Air Base in Miami, Florida. The command center is so top secret that only a few men working directly under the president himself know where it is.
Why Miami? Because first of all, it was outside of Washington, D.C. If they'd placed it in Washington, D.C., the whole operation would have been exposed.
With the command center in place, the CIA now need a figurehead who can lead a rebel force against the Guatemalan president.
The leader had to be somebody who was malleable, who would obey CIA edicts, and would be loyal to the U.S. government.
The CIA place its bets on a man called Carlos Castillo Armas. Armas is a charismatic and ambitious Guatemalan colonel. 3 years earlier, he was involved in a failed military coup. He'd been locked up by the Guatemalans and, according to rumor, had made a brave escape. The CIA find him living in exile in Honduras.
The CIA had decided he was the perfect candidate to lead the charge and reestablish, through him, U.S. control of Guatemala.
Armas is flown to the command center at Opa-locka, and a deal is struck. The next challenge is to build a guerrilla rebel force who will lead the uprising. The CIA set up a top-secret training base in the jungles of Central America. The man assigned to train the secret army is Rip Robertson, an ex-paramilitary black ops specialist.
He loved being out there in the jungle. Some people thrive on it. You can't take a real warrior out of the war, and that's how Robertson was.
Rip Robertson loved this kind of stuff. This was what he was born to do. And for him to be paid to operate under the auspices of the U.S. government must have been nirvana for him.
Come on! Come on!
In January 1954, training begins. Robertson is told to turn these men into a trained fighting force in just 6 months. The troops are Guatemalan exiles, recruited from neighboring countries in Central America. Among them, professional mercenaries. Keeping the rebel force to no more than 400 men allows them to train in total secrecy.
Rip Robertson, he had to train his team in guerrilla tactics. Like they say in special operations, you can come in, cause your damage, and get out undetected.
Robertson trains them in sabotage, demolition, and weaponry, and puts them through a grueling routine that will get them across Guatemala's tough terrain. But this is the easy part. Armas and his handful of mercenaries must now face a formidable opponent, the Guatemalan army.
Guatemala had the largest army and the largest police force in Central America. They had 6,000 in their army and 3,000 in the police force. No other country in Central America could match that.
At the moment, the army is loyal to its recently elected leader, Arbenz, who enjoys the support of the Guatemalan people. Arbenz is also a skilled general.
Arbenz himself was a respected military man, considered brilliant and cultured by the CIA itself.
Pitted against a popular and powerful opponent and his loyal army, the CIA face what now seems overwhelming odds.
So here's the question. How do you take a rebel force of about 200 or maybe 400 men and put it up against an army of 5,000 to 6,000 men?
The CIA think they have the answer. A secret weapon developed covertly within the agency that has never before been tried out this close to American soil. Until now.
Psychological warfare, or PSYOPs, revolves around deception, lies, doing things, dirty tricks that you couldn't get away with if you revealed your identity.
PSYOPs has been around since the Second World War, but until now had never been tried on this scale.
This was the first time the CIA had ever tried this kind of maneuver to overthrow a government.
The CIA recruits radio and public relations expert David Atlee Phillips to run the psychological warfare part of the operation. They call it Operation Sherwood. This is aimed directly at undermining the president's popularity by turning hearts and minds.
So what do? They create a clandestine radio station. They call it Radio Liberación, or Voice of Liberation. The idea of the radio station would be to present it as the secret voice of the Army of Liberation that was about to come and free the people of Guatemala.
The first phase of Operation Sherwood will take place at Opa-locka. To help him, Phillips flies in 2 Guatemalan radio announcers, who declassified files refer to as Mario and Pepe. As part of the psychological offensive, they must put together hundreds of hours of radio recordings, which will later be broadcast in Guatemala itself.
So one of the first questions facing the CIA operatives is, who do we target?
Phillips has a choice. Do they target the ordinary Guatemalans, the intellectual elite, or even religious leaders?
Yes, we target all those people, but our main target is the army.
Targeting the army and the generals is critical. Phillips knows that it's the generals and senior officers who are their single biggest obstacle.
So all of this feeds into the central goal of the Black PSYOPs, which is to drive a wedge between Arbenz and the military.
Phillips devises a series of radio shows designed to split the army away from its leader.
One of them was called We Accuse of High Treason, and it specifically charged that Arbenz had abandoned the army, had betrayed the army, were traitors, and needed to be dealt with swiftly and urgently.
The aim of the treason shows is to plant the idea that officers siding with the government would receive severe treatment after the coup d'etat.
Here are more names to include on the blacklist of traitors to the country.
Next, Phillips targets the officers where they are most vulnerable, their pockets.
One of their campaigns suggested that the currency was about to collapse and that Arbenz would no longer have the money to pay the officers. Nothing inspires more fear in the ranks of hired guns than the lack of a paycheck.
Guatemala are nevoie de democrație. Toată lumea trebuie să afle bani.
Day after day, night after night, for 6 entire weeks, Phillips and his team make hundreds of recordings. Once the recordings are ready, the CIA transport the tapes from Opa-locka in Florida to a secret radio station close to the border of Guatemala.
To this day, we still don't know where Operation Sherwood was broadcasting from. Some reports have it in the jungle in Honduras. Others have it in a barn on the farm belonging to the dictator of Nicaragua.
Less than 3 months after Phillips is recruited, Radio Liberación goes live.
Radio Liberación, Transmitiendo desde
Radio Liberación, broadcasting from a secret place within the Republic, will be on air twice a day.
veces al día.
The propaganda radio shows made in Opa-locka are now heard all across Guatemala by tens of thousands of local listeners, unaware that this is a CIA plot. Meanwhile, with Rip Robertson's trained rebel force ready to strike, the CIA now execute the final piece of the master plan: to isolate President Arbenz politically. Setting up the isolation game begins in late October 1953, when the CIA fly American diplomat John Purifoy to Guatemala.
Ambassador Purifoy was carefully picked for his arrogant personality, for his hard rock anti-communism.
His job is to ramp up pressure on President Arbenz.
Purifoy was very flamboyant. He wore Borsalino-type hats with feathers in them. He always seemed to carry a shoulder holster with a pistol in it.
His first attack on Arbenz comes only a few weeks later, when he's invited to meet the country's president.
You have this extraordinary scene. All Purifoy does is harangue him about communists in his government.
And that really sort of laid down the marker of how Purifoy was going to behave from then on out.
One of Purifoy's first jobs is to set up a secret CIA office inside Guatemala City. But where would an ambassador set up an operations center without being spotted by the government? It is, of course, the US Embassy, where he himself is based.
They took over an entire floor of the embassy to do all the internal planning that had to be done in order to achieve the ultimate objective, which was to get rid of Jacobo Arbenz. You would have seen a secretive area of the embassy totally committed to the operational work to get rid of the Arbenz regime, which would have meant, maps, lines of authority, individuals to be contacted, planning different tactics that were going to be used. The whole schmear, basically, would be devoted to figuring out in a very deliberate way to get rid of this government.
With the CIA base inside the embassy established, Purifoy sets about finding who among the Guatemalan elite could possibly be turned against their own government.
Part of the effort at the US Embassy was to pay money to get army officers to defect. This was a crucial operation because the CIA planners felt that if the army could be undermined, then that would be the end of Arbenz. That was the one defense that Arbenz had that was impregnable at that point, and it was difficult to figure out how to get around it. So much of the time was spent on trying to encourage officers to defect through monetary payments. In fact, at one point, the money was offered to Arbenz himself to give up power. And of course, he threw that person out of the office for having even suggested it. So this was an attempt to pull out the underpinnings of the army and make it so weak that it would be virtually worthless as a protective operation for Arbenz.
While Purifoy works the enemy inside Guatemala itself, the CIA turn their attention to the world at large in their search to undermine Arbenz. The CIA needs something big. A political incident so damaging that it will allow America to unleash a political barrage against Arbenz.
They were, in fact, looking for a raison d'etre to give them justification for what they were about to do, and it fell into their laps.
The CIA's lucky break comes not in Guatemala, but 6,000 miles away in communist Eastern Europe. In April 1954, a CIA spy based in Poland spots suspect cargo being loaded onto a ship called the Helm.
They were able to figure out that this ship had unusual characteristics, that it was probably carrying weapons.
The spy reports the Helm to the CIA, alerting it to the fact it could be heading towards the Americas. The CIA tracks the progress of the Helm as it heads towards the Caribbean.
They traced the voyage of the Helm through its shipping lane to Dakar in Africa and then on to the Dutch West Indies.
But after 3 weeks, it suddenly makes a sharp turn and heads south.
Ending up, totally to their surprise but pleasure, Puerto Boreas in Guatemala.
Four weeks later, the Helm docks. When it does, the CIA see all the evidence they need, crate after crate of it. In total, 2,000 tons of small arms, including rifles, machine guns, and mortars.
That gave them proof that the communists were truly infiltrating this country, and it gave them justification for invading it.
Eisenhower now has all the diplomatic ammunition he needs to unleash a political firestorm against Arbenz. In response to the arms shipment, he sends warships, planes, and submarines to patrol the coastline of Guatemala.
Everything in the arsenal was configured to bring down the Guatemalan government. Eisenhower was fully behind it.
Arbenz can now only watch in horror as his country is strangled by a naval blockade. Arbenz and his generals begin to wonder if America itself will even invade.
Arbenz understood that there was a significant campaign mounted against him by that point.
Alarmed at Washington's show of force, Arbenz tries to build political bridges with America.
He sent out his foreign minister, Torriello, to meet with Purifoy, the American ambassador, to see if they could work out a truce.
The last thing the CIA want now is a truce. Operation PB Success has only one mission: regime change. In mid-June, the 500-strong rebel army is transported to forward attack bases close to the Guatemalan border. They're deployed to 5 strike points along Guatemala's eastern front. By splitting into 5, the CIA aimed to create the illusion of a much bigger army than it really is.
They created the dramatic sense that this was an all-encompassing assault from the Pacific side to the Atlantic side, from the neighboring countries, that would destroy every defense Guatemala had and allow Castillo-Ramos to take over the country.
In support of the ground invasion, the CIA also deploy a dozen unmarked aircraft to the front line.
They were flown down by serving U.S. Air Force officers who to date have not been identified.
From the point of view of military psychology, the aircraft were a tremendously important asset.
The planes will not only back up the troops, but play a key part of the psychological operation by enhancing the illusion of a huge invasion. With the Air Force on standby and the Army poised and ready for action, the CIA contact the leader of the Guatemalan rebels, Castillo-Armas, and green light the invasion.
There's a lot dependent on this op, and they can't let it go wrong.
The coup d'etat now begins. In late evening, coup leader Castillo Armas is on a remote road close to the Guatemalan border. He leads 120 of the total force of 500 soldiers. They are the eastern prong of the invasion. If all goes to plan, in just a few days' time, he will be Guatemala's next president.
As they approached the border, they saw that there was 2 guards.
One of the guards is a customs official. He's quickly overpowered.
The first shot's fired in this coup attempt. Right there, chaos.
The second guard lies dead as the convoy crosses the border into Guatemala. The plan is to continue the advance on foot. The CIA favors a guerrilla approach to hide the true size of the force.
The longer they can have the army to believe that there are thousands of people in there, the greater advantage they had.
Armas's men head through the tough terrain for 3 entire days.
The jungle's thick, it's hard to navigate. You also have torrential downpours.
On day 3 of the invasion, they reach the small town of Escalation. After a short battle with local policemen, Castillo Armas wins his first victory.
People of Escalation would have been a bit shocked by these guerrillas showing up in their main square. Some of the troops did was they handed guns out to various puzzled residents of this village to give them the sense that these people were joining forces with Castillo Armas to finally oust Arbenz.
Meanwhile, 100 miles north of Armas, the second prong of the invasion crossed the border. They run into an army garrison at Gualan. The battle is the fiercest in the invasion so far. It rages for 36 hours. It's the first big test for Rip Robertson's CIA-trained mercenaries.
You're going to take their lives, or they're going to try to take your life. And it's life or death at that point.
But then, it starts to go wrong. One by one, the rebels begin to flee. When the remaining soldiers realize what is happening, none of them wants to be captured and charged as traitors.
People are going to see these people fleeing, 2, 3, 5, 6 people fleeing. They're going to start thinking that might be the best thing to do. And that's one of the problems you have with a ragtag army.
In the end, almost the entire second column flees back to the border. This is the first major setback for the rebels. Many of their troops are wounded or killed. In Washington, the situation is about to get worse. The plan was to ramp up pressure on the Guatemalan president in the diplomatic arena. But world leaders are now suspicious of America's stance.
The Arbenz government decided to go to several international bodies to seek protection. The first was the United Nations. The second was the Organization of American States, the OAS.
In Caracas, the 10th Inter-American Conference hears Foreign Minister Torriello of Guatemala, whose country is the target of a United States resolution against communism in the hemisphere. While accepting the resolution...
The United Nations even agree to assemble an investigation team to analyze the invasion. This risks exposure of the CIA plot. Facing international humiliation and a failed coup d'etat costing millions of dollars, time is running out for Operation PB success. Back in Guatemala, the rest of the invasion is going from bad to worse. The third prong of the invasion, in El Salvador, doesn't even make it into Guatemala. 60 rebels are arrested as they try to cross the border. The fourth prong, attacking Puerto Barrios in the north, is defeated by armed dock workers.
The reality of the situation was beginning to look bleak.
There is still more bad news for the CIA. Even the air attacks fail to hit targets. Almost all the strike aircraft are paralyzed by mechanical failure.
That basically reduced their air assault by 50 or 60%.
As a result of that, the invasion force was basically stymied in terms of their air support, and they were concerned that they were not going to be able to follow through without the show of force.
With the all-important Air Force grounded and Almas's uprising only 6 miles into Guatemala, the whole CIA operation now hangs in the balance.
Only the top CIA managers knew how close this whole thing came to failure.
A few days into the assault, the CIA receives a top-secret intelligence estimate, now declassified, that says we don't know where this thing is going to go. If the Army sides with Arbenz, our whole campaign is lost. But if it turns against Arbenz, this could be a victory.
As the operation reaches crisis point, Alan Dulles, head of the CIA, holds a top-secret emergency meeting with President Eisenhower. The president is shocked when he hears about the military failures.
Eisenhower was puzzled because he thought everything had been going correctly according to the plans of the CIA.
Dulles tells it to him straight. The only chance of reversing the catastrophic invasion is if the president himself provides a small contingent of America's best fighter planes.
So he asked Dulles point blank, can you really win this if I give you 2 more planes? And Dulles said, well, I think there's a 20% chance we can win this. And Eisenhower at that point paused and said, all right, I'll give you the planes.
Declassified files now reveal that the president provides Dulles with 2 brand new F-47 bombers at a cost of $150,000.
Well, the F-47N Thunderbolts were certainly the most powerful aircraft in Central America at that time.
Concerned that someone would discover US involvement, the CIA have the American badges removed from the planes as they're smuggled to Central America.
They have a sense that, you know, this thing might not actually work out, but we've got to try anyway.
Whether the F-47s will be enough to turn the tide of the invasion is a gamble. But the CIA still have one last trump card yet to play: psychological warfare.
Operation PB's success was all based on illusions. It was based on the idea that you could create in the mind of the Guatemalan people that this huge force of rebels was about to take over the country.
So the CIA upped the tempo on the Radio Liberación transmissions and began round-the-clock news bulletins that talk of a devastating invasion.
If you tuned into the radio, you would hear one story after another of a rebel victory. You would hear railroad tracks being bombed. You would hear fuel depots being sabotaged. The reality was entirely different. Armas's army was hundreds of miles away, barely 6 miles into the country.
Next, the CIA targets the Guatemalan military.
A major victory for the CIA in Operation Sherwood came when a colonel, the former head of the Guatemalan Air Force, defects, flies his own private aircraft across the border, and turns himself into the CIA.
David Atlee Phillips, in charge of the radio campaign, wants the colonel to announce his defection live on air. But he refuses.
Phillips says, okay, have a scotch. Have another scotch. Next thing you know, the guy's sort of in a semi-drunken stupor.
With the colonel becoming increasingly drunk, Phillips secretly records his words on a reel-to-reel machine as he recounts his defection.
As soon as Phillips could, he spliced the tape and put it on air.
Not only are other Air Force officers listening to the radio broadcast, but so is President Arbenz. The president immediately grounds the Guatemalan Air Force, afraid that its officers might defect too.
It was a major triumph for Operation Sherwood.
But the tricks do not stop here. They get more and more deceptive.
One of the clever tricks the radio station did to try to enhance its credibility was it faked an attack on the radio station.
So
if you were tuned in, you would hear their typical broadcast, and all of a sudden you would hear shouts and screams. You actually heard children in the background shuffling around. And then the radio went dead. No sound.
But it is all a hoax, to fool the listeners into thinking the underground radio station has resurfaced.
The next day, the radio comes back on the air, triumphant. We're back.
The next act of deception comes when the 2 brand new F-47s arrive in Guatemala. 6 days into the invasion, the air assault begins.
They'd never seen anything like an F-47N Thunderbolt making a low, very aggressive attack over their city.
When we first heard the planes, my mom got very scared, and she hid us all under the bed. It was a difficult time because we'd never lived through a war before.
The aerial campaign is so shocking that the local Guatemalans invent a memorable nickname for the falling bombs: sulfatos.
Sulfato, of course, is a Spanish term meaning laxative, something that would make you go to the facility. That's the gross effect that it had upon the Guatemalan populace.
After the bombing, strafing.
Strafing from the air is probably one of the most terrifying things that a person on the ground can endure. You have an aircraft that's making an enormous amount of noise. You don't seem to be able to get away from it. It's coming directly at you, it seems, with guns blazing out of the wings.
We were very afraid. It was painful. It was utterly horrific.
So imagine the scene in Guatemala, a country that had not experienced terrifying bombing raids, right? And all of a sudden, a low-flying aircraft, engines blazing, dropping an explosive. A loud, colossal sound erupts over the vicinity.
For all the terror, declassified CIA files reveal something surprising.
I don't think they'd wanted to do a lot of damage.
Had the F-47s really wanted to unleash a devastating aerial attack, they would have used the 500-pound bombs for which they were designed. But they didn't.
If they'd gone in there with 500-pounders, F-47N can carry at least 3 500-pounders. They could have done a lot of damage.
In fact, the damage was more show than it was real. Records suggest that not a single death occurred, or even one heavy-duty bomb is dropped during the campaign.
In some cases, actually, they dropped Coke bottles from the aircraft because the popping of the glass sounded like a loud explosion.
This is all part of the psychological operation. The aim of the aerial campaign is not to kill, but to create chaos and panic among the Guatemalan population.
One time they drop a big bomb that isn't actually an explosive device, but it releases a huge black cloud over the city, creating the sense that something horrific had happened.
The smoke bomb leads many local Guatemalans to believe that they are under direct attack.
That was when we saw it. That black smoke was coming out from some place in the capital.
The CIA's psychological tactics go even further.
Another piece of Black Ops tradecraft was to replicate the sounds of a bombing run. So they actually outfitted the embassy in Guatemala City with huge loudspeakers that played the sounds of a bombing run, of jet craft going overhead, to inspire fear among the population.
What the people were saying was that lots were going to be killed and that it was better for them not to get involved in the defense of their government.
En la defensa del gobierno.
Although the psychological offensive is beginning to work, the rebel army is down to a last desperate handful of troops only 6 miles into the country itself. And Arbenz is still in power. The CIA is about to make an incredible gamble to bluff its way from defeat to stunning victory.
Right at this critical stage, Phillips introduced what he called his most important big lie.
The important big lie is the final stage of the fake radio broadcasts, presenting an entirely made-up version of the invasion.
So in some ways, there were 2 invasions. There was the real invasion that showed a paltry invasion force, its numbers reduced by half. And then there was the map created by Radio Liberación. It suggested the force was having unimpeded progress.
The CIA radio broadcasts tell of one victory after another, an invasion which in reality doesn't exist at all.
Rebel forces were moving. They were moving towards the capital. The invasion was successful. The uprising was coming. It was one tale after another of the inevitable victory of the rebel forces.
The biggest lie of all is when the radio reports that thousands and thousands of fictitious soldiers are closing in on Guatemala City itself.
And the lie was that 2 military columns were advancing on the capital, ready to take it over.
The big lie gamble now pays off.
Thousands fled the city. Car traffic stopped. The city itself was slowly becoming paralyzed.
Y la gente se fue a la periferia de la ciudad.
People ran to the outskirts of the city. They were fleeing to safety.
The critical moment of the big lie is when the senior officers turn against the Guatemalan president.
The big payoff for black psyops comes when several Army colonels make clear to Arbenz that they're not going to stand with him. They basically tell him, you and your communist friends have got us in trouble with the Americans, and now you've got to step down.
One by one, the officers around Arbenz distance themselves from the isolated president.
So you're a colonel in the Guatemalan army. You're hearing news of military action, and you're starting to ask yourself, where am I going to be? Where am I going to stand when the dust settles?
Politically isolated, the pressure on Arbenz surges to dizzying heights. Not only does he fear defeat at the hands of his bitter enemy, Armas, but also the terrifying prospect that America is behind him.
It's not the issue of us fighting Castillo Armas and his guys. It's that the United States is threatening to invade and we'd have to fight them.
He was sitting in his presidential office, bewildered and unsure what to do. He had collapsed internally. The CIA had brilliantly undermined him. And that was really the end of his reign.
With the officers turning against him, on June the 27th, Arbenz resigns.
He just couldn't handle it. The psychological pressures were too enormous.
Ten days later, Castillo Armas is sworn in as Guatemala's new president. The exiled colonel, who just over a week earlier was a relatively unknown figure, is now the most powerful man in the country. In Washington, Operation PB Success goes down as a huge victory.
By all accounts, this is an operation that should not have succeeded. This was made possible by gutsy determination and, in some ways, crazy abandon.
Operation PB Success was a brilliant deception, one of the great artistic achievements of illusion that the CIA ever produced.
Operation PB Success proved that psychological warfare could be used as a deadly and effective weapon. It fooled an entire country and ultimately brought down a president. Within the CIA, PB Success becomes the model for future regime change across the world.